The cost of staying where you don't belong. Carl Jung observed that a life outgrown does not announce itself with fire or with drama. It announces itself as a slow and patient exhaustion that has no name, a tiredness that sleep does not fix. And you have felt this. You have called it stress. You have called it a phase. You have called it needing a vacation, when what it may actually be is the psyche informing you, quietly and without cruelty, that you are living inside a room you have already outgrown. Here is where I want to begin, with Nietzsche, whom Jung read closely and returned to across a decade of seminars. And Nietzsche wrote in The Joyful Wisdom, in paragraph 270, "You shall become the person you are." And I want you to notice the strangeness of that sentence, because it is not become someone new, it is not become someone better, it is become the one you already, secretly, underneath all the accommodations, already are. And Jung would stop you right there and say, "Do you see it? The tragedy is never that people fail to become someone impressive. The tragedy is that they succeed at becoming someone else entirely. Someone shaped by a room, a role, a family expectation, a version of themselves assembled for survival, and then they stay loyal to that assembled self, long after the room has stopped fitting. And that loyalty, that quiet daily loyalty to a self you have outgrown, is the cost this video is named for. So let me offer you 3 sentences, and see if any of them land the way a key lands in a lock. I say to myself, I have been mistaking familiarity for belonging. I say to myself, the discomfort I keep managing is not a flaw in me, it is information from me. I say to myself, staying has a price, and I have been paying it quietly for years. And if something in you just went still when you heard that, good. That stillness is the beginning of honesty, and here is the phrase Jung's whole psychology keeps circling back to, whether he is writing about the shadow, or the persona, or the long second half of life. Say it with me. I make the unconscious conscious. And again, slowly, I make the unconscious conscious. Before we go further, I want to invite you to subscribe, quietly, the way you'd agree to keep meeting a friend by the fire, so that tomorrow's teaching finds you the way this one did. And if any part of this is landing somewhere tender right now, somewhere you recognize but have not said out loud, type the 2 words, face it, just those 2 words, down in the comments. Let it be less a comment and more a small private seal. A way of marking that you saw something true and did not look away. The first key is, the room did not betray you. It simply stopped growing, and you kept growing, and now the 2 of you are out of proportion to each other. And this is the first thing Jung would want you to understand clearly, before any of the harder material. Because most people, when they feel that they no longer belong somewhere, immediately reach for blame. They think, something is wrong with this job, or this town, or this marriage, or something is wrong with me for feeling this way about a life I once chose gladly. And both of those explanations miss the actual mechanism. Jung taught that the psyche is not static. It does not arrive fully formed and then sit still for the rest of your life. It develops in stages, the way a body does, and a self that was exactly right for you at 25 can become, without any villain involved, without any betrayal on either side, simply too small for you at 40, or 50, or 60, the way a coat that fit perfectly is not a bad coat when it no longer closes over your shoulders. It is only a coat that was sized for an earlier you. Think of the house you grew up visiting for the holidays, the one that once felt enormous, the ceilings high, the hallway long enough to run down, and how strange it feels now to stand in that same hallway as an adult and find it small, almost cramped, and nothing in the house has changed. Not one wall has moved. What changed is entirely you. This is exactly what happens inside a life, a career, a marriage, a friendship. A whole identity can be the right size for years, and then, quietly, without any dramatic cause, become the hallway you have outgrown. Imagine a man who spends 15 years building a career around being the reliable one, the one who never complains, the one everyone can count on. And one ordinary Tuesday, he sits in a meeting he has sat in 100 times before, and something in him goes quiet in a way that frightens him a little. Not dramatic, not a breakdown, just a small internal voice saying, "I do not belong here anymore." And his first instinct is to silence that voice. Because the room looks the same, the people are kind, the paycheck is fair. Nothing external has changed, and so he assumes the fault must be his, that he is ungrateful, or restless, or broken in some way, when in fact what has happened is exactly what Jung described. An inner situation, unattended, has begun to make itself known, not because the room turned hostile, but because he outgrew its dimensions while still standing politely inside them. And this is not weakness. This is development, doing exactly what development does, quietly, without asking your permission, without checking whether the timing is convenient. And here is the angle I want you to keep. The discomfort is not the problem. The discomfort is the messenger, sent from the part of you that has already moved on ahead, waiting patiently for the rest of you to catch up. My first vow tonight is this: I will stop asking what is wrong with the room before I ask what has changed in me. The second key is, staying costs something, and the bill is paid in a currency so quiet you can go years without noticing the withdrawals. This is not a bill delivered in a dramatic envelope. It is paid in small daily installments, a slight flatness in the evenings, a laugh that takes a half-second longer to arrive than it used to, a low hum of low-grade fatigue that no amount of rest resolves, because rest is not what is being spent. What is being spent is aliveness itself, spent on maintaining a version of you that the room requires, but that you, underneath, no longer are. And Jung understood this as a kind of leak in the vessel. Energy that should be feeding your development, instead going toward the daily labor of performing fit, of performing belonging you do not feel. And I want you to notice that this currency has more than one denomination. There is the coin of attention, spent rehearsing conversations before you have them, so that nothing slips out that might reveal the distance between you and the role. There is the coin of memory, spent quietly editing the stories you tell about your own life, so they still sound like the life of someone who belongs where you are. And there is the coin of imagination itself, spent suppressing the small, unbidden pictures of a different Tuesday, a different house, a different way of spending an afternoon. Because those pictures are inconvenient to the room you have agreed to keep occupying, think for a moment of the actual arithmetic of an ordinary week spent this way. Monday costs you the small effort of arranging your face into enthusiasm you do not have. Wednesday costs you the exhausting work of laughing at a joke that used to be funny and now only sounds like static. Friday costs you the strange grief of realizing you cannot quite remember why you chose this particular room in the first place. And none of these costs show up on any ledger anyone else can see, which is exactly why they are so easy to underestimate. You tell yourself it is nothing. You tell yourself everyone feels tired. You tell yourself this is simply what adulthood is. And Jung would gently push back on that story, because ordinary tiredness has a shape. It comes and it goes with sleep and rest. But this other tiredness, the one that persists no matter how well you sleep, is not physical at all. It is the specific fatigue of divided loyalty. One part of you loyal to the room, one part of you loyal to whoever you are actually becoming. And holding both loyalties at once, quietly, for years, is exhausting in a way no vacation touches. Because you cannot rest your way out of a psychic debt. You can only stop accruing it. Consider a woman who spends her weekdays in a role she performs well, competent, agreeable, unbothered, and who notices, only on the drive home each evening, a strange and specific heaviness settle into her shoulders. Not from the work itself, which is not so hard, but from the sustained effort of being a version of herself that fits the office, and not the version that fits her actual life. And she assumes for years that this heaviness is simply what commuting feels like, until one evening she sits in the car in her own driveway for 11 full minutes before she can make herself go inside. And it is only then that she recognizes the heaviness for what it has always been, Not traffic, not tiredness, but the accumulated weight of a self held at a slight, constant angle from its true shape. Pause for a moment now and pick one real place in your life where you feel this particular flatness. Not despair, just flatness, a small subtraction of aliveness, and simply name to yourself where it lives. Do not fix it yet, only name it, because naming is the first act of no longer paying in silence. My second vow tonight is this: I will stop mistaking my exhaustion for laziness and start reading it as a bill. The third key is, this cost does not arrive once, it arrives in an ordinary week, over and over, disguised as normal life. So let us walk through one. Not a crisis week, an entirely unremarkable one. Because the unremarkable is where this actually lives. Imagine it is Monday morning. The alarm goes off, and before your feet touch the floor, there is already a small bracing, a gathering of yourself for a day that requires you to be a version of you that fits the room, rather than the version that is quietly true. By 9, you are at your desk, or in your kitchen, or wherever the role is performed, and you notice, if you are honest, a low static under everything. Not sadness exactly, more like wearing a sweater one size too tight, and having simply gotten used to the restriction, so that you no longer notice you are restricted. By Tuesday afternoon, someone says something completely ordinary, mentions a trip they are planning, or a class they are taking, or a book they loved, and you feel a small stab of something you cannot immediately name. And if you sat with that stab honestly, you would find it is longing, not envy exactly, longing, for a version of a week that does not require this particular performance. By Wednesday evening, you are tired in that specific flat way we named a moment ago. And you tell yourself it has been a long week, though nothing unusual has happened. Notice too, on Wednesday, the body's own quiet ledger, a tightness across the shoulders that has nothing to do with lifting anything. A shallow breath you catch yourself taking as though the day itself required rationing. The body keeps its own accounts long before the mind agrees to read them. By Thursday, you catch yourself daydreaming, mid-conversation, about an entirely different life. Not a dramatic escape, just a quieter fit, a room sized correctly. And you feel a small guilt for the daydream and push it away. And think for a moment how strange that guilt actually is, that the mind should apologize for wanting to breathe. By Friday, you are relieved the week is ending. And here is the quiet tragedy hidden in that relief. You are not relieved because the week was hard. You are relieved because for 2 days you get to stop performing. And even Sunday carries its own small tax. That faint dread that arrives before the week has even begun again. A dread with no single cause you could point to, only the accumulated weight of 5 days already spent bracing. And if you tally that week honestly, 5 days of low-grade bracing, 1 moment of unexpected longing, 1 evening of unexplainable flatness, 1 daydream pushed away out of guilt, and 1 relief that was really a small escape, that is the actual cost of staying where you don't belong, added up in ordinary hours, none of them dramatic enough to complain about, all of them together dramatic enough to hollow you out slowly across years. And here is what makes this so easy to miss. None of these costs compound visibly the way debt does on a statement. There is no monthly notice, no total arriving in the mail. The withdrawals are small enough to explain away individually. A long week, a rough Tuesday, a tired Wednesday. And it is only when you step back far enough to see a year of such weeks stacked against each other that the shape becomes unmistakable. Jung wrote that neurosis is often a substitute for legitimate suffering. And I want you to hear that carefully here. The legitimate suffering would be admitting plainly, this no longer fits me, and doing the harder work that admission requires. The substitute suffering is this quieter, more socially acceptable erosion, the flatness, the static, the guilty daydream, the Sunday dread, all of it easier to bear in small doses than 1 honest sentence spoken out loud. And so the week repeats, and the years repeat the week. And the strange mercy in seeing this clearly is that once you can name the small hours for what they are, you are no longer simply enduring them, you are finally accounting for them. My third vow tonight is this: I will start counting the small hours honestly, instead of averaging them into normal. The fourth key is, what actually keeps you there is rarely the room itself. It is loyalty. Loyalty to who you used to be. Loyalty to the person who chose this room in good faith. Loyalty to the effort you have already spent making it work. And loyalty is a virtue almost everywhere except here, because a loyalty owed to a version of yourself that no longer exists is not virtue, it is a kind of quiet imprisonment dressed up as integrity. Imagine someone who built an entire identity around being the strong one in her family, the one who does not need help, the one everyone leans on, and for 20 years that identity served her well. It earned her respect. It gave her a clear sense of who she was in every room she entered. But somewhere in her 40s, something in her began to ache in a way she could not explain. Not weakness exactly. More like the specific exhaustion of holding up a role that had quietly stopped being true. And when a close friend gently suggested she let someone take care of her for once, she felt something close to panic. Not because the offer was unwelcome, but because accepting it would mean admitting the role no longer fit. And admitting that felt, to her, like betraying the woman who had built her whole sense of belonging around never needing anything. And I want you to notice how small the daily evidence of this loyalty can be. Consider a man who has spent his whole life being known as the funny one, the one who lightens every room he enters, and now, in a private season of tiredness he cannot explain to anyone, he still shows up at the family table and performs the old jokes on cue. Not because he feels them, but because the thought of disappointing the room feels somewhere underneath. Like disappointing a boy from decades ago who first learned that being funny was how he earned his place at that very table. And this is the strange arithmetic hiding inside almost every case of staying too long. You are rarely protecting the room in front of you at all. You are protecting an earlier self who is no longer even present to know the difference. This is the exact shape of the loyalty that keeps people staying where they no longer belong. It is not stubbornness. It is grief avoidance. Because to leave the room, even quietly, even just internally, means grieving the person you were while you were in it. And most people would rather stay mildly suffocated than face that grief directly. Think of it as a photograph kept pressed flat in a drawer, worn soft at the corners from years of handling. You do not return to it because it shows you who you are now. You return to it because it shows you who you were safe as. And putting it down feels, for one long breath, like a small death. But it is not death. It is only the quiet expiration of a contract nobody remembers signing. And here is the part Jung would want you to sit with longest. That old self is not your enemy. She built the room you are now outgrowing. And she built it with the tools and understanding she had at the time. She is not to be abandoned with contempt. She is to be thanked. And then, gently, let go of. The way you thank an old coat before you finally give it away. Not because it failed you, but because it did its job for the season it was made for. The room owes you nothing anymore. It is you who keeps renewing a debt on its behalf. My fourth vow tonight is this: I will honor who I was without asking her to keep living my life for me. Tomorrow's teaching will find you more easily if you are already here waiting for it. So if this is speaking to something real, consider staying close by subscribing. I will not ask twice, but I mean it once, warmly, because this work goes further when it is not walked alone. The fifth key is the deepest one, and I want to walk it in 3 separate turns, because it will not open all at once. First, consider this. Jung wrote in his essay on the stages of life that we cannot live the afternoon of life according to the program of life's morning, for what was great in the morning will be little at evening, and what in the morning was true will at evening have become a lie. And I want you to sit with the word program, because that is exactly what most of us are running without knowing it. An early set of instructions, written by circumstance, by family, by the particular hungers of youth, instructions that said, prove yourself here, be needed there, stay small in this direction, achieve loudly in that one. And that program is not wrong, it is simply timed. It was built for a morning, and a morning program run at 4 in the afternoon does not produce failure exactly. It produces this specific hollow feeling of technical success and emotional exile. You did everything the program demanded, and somehow you still feel like a guest in your own life. And here is what makes this so hard to catch in real time. The program does not announce itself as a program, it disguises itself as simply who you are, so you never think to question the instruction itself. You only question your own performance of it. You ask, am I doing this well enough? When the deeper question waiting underneath is this even still the assignment? Imagine someone who spent her whole morning proving she could carry more than anyone else without complaint, and now finds herself, decades later, in an afternoon that keeps asking a completely different question. Not can you carry more, but do you still need to? And she cannot yet hear the second question, because the first one has been playing on repeat for so long it has become indistinguishable from her own voice. First turn of the key, then, is this. The flatness is not a malfunction, it is the program running past its intended hour. Second, consider what Jung called the unlived life. He taught that whatever we refuse to live consciously does not simply vanish, it goes underground, and waits, and eventually it returns. Sometimes as restlessness, sometimes as irritability toward people who are living the thing you refused, sometimes as a low, persistent ache with no clear object. Imagine a man who spent his whole first half proving himself financially, disciplined, admired, secure, and who quietly buried, decades ago, an entirely different hunger for solitude, for making something with his hands, for a slower, unremarkable life he once dismissed as impractical. And now in his 50s, that hunger does not knock politely. It shows up as unexplained irritation at work, as envy he cannot quite name when a friend downsizes, as a strange grief at the sight of an old workshop he passes on his drive home. And notice how sideways this ache arrives. It rarely walks up and introduces itself honestly. It wears the mask of a bad mood, of a short temper with someone who did nothing wrong, of a restlessness, blamed on the weather or the traffic or simply getting older. Imagine a woman who long ago set aside a hunger to write, telling herself there would be time later, and who now finds she cannot sit through a friend's book club without a strange tightness in her chest. Not because she dislikes her friends, but because the unlived writer in her recognizes, in that ordinary room, a life she quietly closed the door on years before. She calls it irritability. She calls it being tired of small talk. And Jung would say, gently, look again. That is not irritation at the room. That is grief for a door you shut so long ago you forgot you were the one who shut it. None of this is regression. It is not going backward. It is the unlived portion of you finally presenting its bill, and the bill does not go away if you keep refusing to open the envelope. It only grows interest. Second turn of the key, then, is this. The ache is not weakness returning. It is the unlived portion of you, finally asking to be let in. Third, and this is the turn that ties the first two together, Jung recalled in his own memoirs, a period near his own late 30s, after the break with Freud, when the structure of his professional life, his identity, his sense of belonging in the world he had built, simply stopped fitting, and he did not immediately understand it as growth. At first it felt like disintegration, like something collapsing rather than something completing. He described those years as a confrontation with the unconscious, so disorienting that he sometimes doubted his own stability. And it took him considerable time and considerable courage, working alone, without a map, before he could recognize that what looked like falling apart was in fact the early architecture of becoming someone larger than the role he had outgrown. And this matters enormously for you, because if you are feeling this now, the sense that a life that once fit you no longer does, you may be interpreting it as failure, as ingratitude, as some flaw in your character, when it may in fact be the exact shape individuation takes from the inside, not a straight line of triumphant growth, but a disorienting, unglamorous sense of no longer belonging where you have belonged for years, a season with no applause and no clear finish line, only the slow, private work of becoming someone the old program never accounted for. And I want to be careful here, because this is not a call to abandon everyone and everything. Jung never taught that. Individuation is not escape. It is not permission to burn down a life because staying feels uncomfortable. It is instead an honest reckoning, a willingness to ask, plainly, what in this room was built by my morning program, and what in me now belongs to the afternoon? And the answer to that question does not always mean leaving. Sometimes it means renegotiating the room itself, showing up differently within it, telling the truth inside a marriage rather than only outside of it, changing how you inhabit a role rather than abandoning the role entirely. But sometimes, honestly, it does mean leaving, and only you, sitting with this quietly, without an audience, can know what individuation actually asks of you is not a location, it is honesty. It asks you to stop asking whether the room is good or bad, and start asking whether it is still true, and if the answer that rises up in you, unbidden, quiet, is no, then the ache you have been managing for years was never a malfunction. It was always the psyche's oldest and most patient method of telling you the truth. My fifth vow tonight, spoken slowly, is this: I will stop treating my own growth as evidence that something is wrong with me. The sixth key is, belonging was never something you were owed by a place. It is something you grow into, the way a tree grows into the exact shape its light requires. And this means the discomfort you have been carrying is not proof that you are lost. It is proof that something in you is still alive enough to want a truer fit. And I want to give you a picture for this, because it is easier felt than explained. Imagine a young couple who move into a small first apartment, and for years, that apartment is exactly right. It holds their whole life comfortably, the same size as their needs. And then, slowly, without any single dramatic day marking the change, they simply grow larger than the rooms, not because the apartment failed them, and not because they failed the apartment, but because life, quietly, kept adding rooms of its own that no square footage could contain. And if they stayed out of loyalty to how happy they once were there, they would spend years mistaking the ache of outgrowing for the ache of ingratitude. This is what most people do with their whole lives, not just their apartments. They assume that if a place once fit, wanting more from it later is a kind of betrayal, when Jung would say it is only ever a kind of honesty. Arriving late, but arriving. And consider, too, the ordinary gardener who keeps a plant in the same small pot for years, watering it faithfully, setting it in the same corner of light, and one season the leaves begin to yellow at the edges for no visible reason, and the gardener assumes something is wrong with the water, or the light, or the plant itself, when the truth, if she lifted it gently from the pot, would be roots wound tightly in a circle, having simply run out of room to spread. And the fear in that moment is always the same fear, that lifting the plant free will hurt it, that disturbing the roots will do more damage than leaving them cramped. And yet anyone who has ever done the lifting knows the opposite is true. The roots loosen, the plant is set into soil that finally matches its size, and within weeks it is greener than it has been in years. Belonging, understood this way, is not a noun you receive once and keep forever. It is closer to a verb, something you practice, something you keep doing the way you keep breathing. And this is oddly merciful news, because it means you are never asked to find the one perfect permanent room and defend it with your whole remaining life. You are only asked to keep telling the truth about the room you are standing in right now, today, this week, and to leave, or to change it, or to stay and rebuild it honestly, according to that truth, rather than according to an old debt to who you used to be. The cost of staying where you don't belong is real. We counted it plainly tonight. The flatness, the static, the guilty daydream, the quiet loyalty to a self who no longer needs defending. But the cost of finally telling the truth about fit, frightening as it is not measured the same way at all. It is measured in exactly the aliveness you have been missing, and it arrives, almost always, more gently than the fear predicted it would. The way the plant does not shatter when it is finally lifted free. It simply, quietly, begins to grow again. My sixth and final vow tonight is this: I will let belonging be something I grow into, not something I inherit and defend forever. Here is the whole picture. The room did not betray you. It simply stopped growing while you kept going. Staying has a cost, and it is paid quietly in ordinary hours you have been calling normal. An entire week can pass with that cost hidden inside small moments of bracing and longing and guilty daydreams. What keeps you there most often is not the room, but loyalty to who you used to be. And beneath all of it is the oldest pattern Jung ever described: the unlived life waiting patiently to be let in, not to punish you, but to complete you. And none of these were 6 separate lessons. They were 6 turns of one single key, the same key, turned a little further each time. The recognition that a life outgrown is not a life failed, and that the tiredness you have been managing for so long was never a flaw in you. It was the truest part of you, still awake, still asking to be heard. I make the unconscious conscious. Again, slowly, I make the unconscious conscious. And so I leave you with the title itself, turned back into a question. Now that you have counted the cost honestly, what is it, exactly, that staying is still asking you to pay?